Hey, appreciate you joining us tonight for our Wednesday night Bible study. We hopefully some folks will start joining in with us, and we'll get started. We're in Daniel chapter 3. If you have been with us for the last couple of weeks, or watched some of our videos, or if you happen to be in church on the first night we started this, when we were actually able to be in church together, we started Daniel. We started with kind of an introduction, and I told you that Daniel divides up fairly well, fairly evenly. The first 6 chapters are primarily historical events. The last six chapters are primarily prophetic events. And I told you there's 3 invasions of Babylon. The first was in 605 BC, the second was in 597 BC, and the third was in 586 BC. This is where the Babylonians invaded the Israelites. And at different times, different things happened. Jeremiah, Ezekiel were involved in the latter 2. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were involved in the first one. In the first 605 BC invasion, Nebuchadnezzar hears that his father Nabopolassar has been killed at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC. And so Nebuchadnezzar swings back through Jerusalem and picks up a lot of young men, a lot of the wise, real good-looking, athletic, the really good young people of Jerusalem, and takes them back to Babylon. And Daniel and the 3 Hebrew children, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as we call them sometimes, they were in that group, so they go back to Babylon. And then chapter 1 tells us that Daniel was raised in the palace. He was taught Babylonian culture, literature, art, everything Babylonian. Daniel was taught. None of that fazed him. None of that really bothered him until they started talking about eating the king's food. Now, the king's food had a religious context to it. It was food that had been sacrificed to idols. And so Daniel protested. They even changed his name, and it didn't really bother him. But when they asked him to alter his worship, here we're talking about a maybe 14-year-old kid. When they started talking about changing his worship, Daniel protested. And he said, I'm not going to do that. So he struck a deal, and he said, if you guys let me eat what I want to eat, vegetables and water for 10 days, then check us out. If we're not better off, we'll give all this up. And so they do. Daniel is better, and he gets kind of promoted. Chapter 2 of Daniel, we talked about last week on a video that I hope you've watched. Daniel chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and it's a troubling dream to him. He sees a statue that has 4 layers of precious metals, and they deteriorate in value as they go down. He sees this statue, and something happens to the statue, and it really bothers him. So it's a gold head, it's a silver chest, it's bronze thighs, and it's silver or iron and clay feet. And then he sees this stone that he says was not cut by hands, that kind of flies into the statue, hits it on the feet, and crumbles it up. And so it bothers him. So he calls all his wise men in, all his magicians in, and he says to them that this thing has troubled me. So he said, I need you guys. And it's kind of I mean, you can almost look at it as a humorous kind of thing. He looks at them and says, I need you guys to not only tell me the interpretation of the dream, but I want you to tell me the dream itself. And then he goes on to say, basically, that you guys have lied to me before and made stuff up. So I'm really not sure that you guys know what you're talking about. And so he says, tell me both. He says, if you do, then you're going to have great rewards, and I'll really make it worth your while. If you don't, I'm going to kill you, and you'll be exterminated. And so they panic, say nobody can do this. They start making all these excuses. Daniel hears about it. And Daniel approaches his superior, and he says, let me go talk to the king. Let me try this. And so Daniel goes in chapter 2 and tells the king his dream and tells him the interpretation. And so the king kind of I guess likes Daniel. You know, they kind of become almost like buddies because he is describing for him this statue. He said, Nebuchadnezzar, you're the gold head. And then after you, he says, is going to come the silver empire. Each of those metals are going to represent an empire. He says, you, the Babylonians, are the gold. Underneath you, coming next, will be the Medo-Persian Empire, represented by the silver. And then underneath them will be the Greek Empire, represented by the bronze. And then underneath them will be the revised Roman Empire, and they'll come after that. And so you and I now are living in an age, and if you remember, if you go back to verses 43 and 44 of Daniel chapter 2, that's a gap in between times. You and I are living in that gap, and we're going to look at that more when we get into chapter 6 and beyond. But Daniel interprets the dream, and it sets the stage for chapter 3. Chapter 3 that we're going to talk about tonight has three purposes. Number one purpose is it gives us an historical account of what actually happened. This is not just a story that we read in Sunday school. It's not just a fictional story that you can check out of a library or something. This is an actual historical event. It actually happened in the land of Babylon. Number two, it has application for us today. Listen to what Romans chapter 15 verse 4 says. For whatever it was written in earlier times was written for our instruction, so that through perseverance in the encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have hope. So it's given to us that we might have hope. It has an application for us today. Some of these stories are strange. Some of them are really bizarre even. Some of them don't make a lot of sense. But they are written so that you and I can understand them, read them and understand them, so that they can encourage us and give us hope for today. Number three, this story is Daniel chapter 3 is in this book because it gives us a prophetic picture of the tribulation period. The 7-year tribulation is just prior to this stone that comes out. That's the gap that we're living in. You and I are living in this prophetic gap, if you will. And so the prophetic picture of the tribulation here is that there's a 7-year tribulation that's going to come right before this smiting stone comes out. During the tribulation, there's going to be an initial time of peace. And you're going to see all this in Daniel, in the book of Daniel, in a lot of it in chapter 3. But at the midpoint of that tribulation and the peace treaty is going to be broken with the Jews, and then there's going to be a great persecution of the Jews. That's going to begin. It tells us that in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, and then if you flip over to Revelation chapter 13, verse 14, it tells you the same thing. It's almost like parallel account. Also, the Antichrist during the tribulation will set up an image. And that's what's going to happen in Daniel chapter 3. Revelation chapter 13, verse 13, the beast and the false prophet are going to use fire to create fear. That's what's going to happen in Daniel chapter 3. Revelation chapter 13, verse 18, the system of the beast in that end times, what we call the eschaton, the end days. The system of the beast has a numerical equivalent attached to it. So all this is going to be reflected in Daniel 3. It's just a kind of a foreshadowing of this end time. Now, if you get right into Daniel chapter 3, let me read just a couple of verses to you, because actually between chapter 2 and chapter 3, there's a very quick transition. It's like Daniel comes in and he interprets the dream, and it's almost like, you know how people, and I know Christy says this about me a lot, and if there's some wives listening to me, you probably say about your own husband, we hear what we want to hear. That's selective hearing kind of thing. So here's what Nebuchadnezzar hears. Daniel says there's a statue, and it's 4 different metals, and he says at the very top, the head, the best, the strongest is you. That's you. You're the gold head of this thing. And then Daniel proceeds to say there's kingdoms that are going to succeed you. So right there he ought to know, my kingdom's not going to last forever. And then he says at the very end there's a stone that comes out of nowhere and crushes the whole statue, and bust the whole thing up. But so in this real quick transition between chapter 2 and chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar gets this inflated ego, I guess, and he builds the statue that he sees. Not really, I guess, fully understanding that Daniel said it's not going to last forever. So look at chapter 3, if you have your Bibles. Chapter 3, verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits, and its width 60 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps and the prefects and the governors and the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. So you get this, he built this statue, then he sends word to all the leaders of Babylon that they should come and basically bring their people with them. And look how what he calls it in verse 2. It's a dedication, he said. We're gonna have this dedication. So immediately after the dream, he begins work on the statue in his own image. Now he's going to build it just like himself, to look like himself. And the reasons for it is the dream, number one, it motivated him to make the real image. He sees it in his dream and he thinks, boy, I really got to make this thing. But I'm going to make it to look just like me. That's his idea. And it's a political move. It's going to kind of elevate his political status. But it's a religious move. That's what he's talking about when he says it come to the dedication. So it has a religious feel to it, a religious context to it. And so verse 2, everybody was there for the dedication. Not worship, he called it, but that's what it was. I mean, he's going to turn it into that. But the pretense is, you guys come for the dedication. We're going to have this unveiling. It's going to be great. Everybody's going to clap for me and think I'm great and all this kind of thing. But it actually lends itself to a worship type experience. Now, there's some similarities between Daniel chapter 3 and the tribulation. Nebuchadnezzar, number one, is a type of the Antichrist. That's what the Antichrist will do. In Daniel chapter 2, verses 48 and 49, look what Nebuchadnezzar does. He makes peace with the Jews. He's going to make peace with, that's what the Antichrist does. He makes peace with the Jews in the first part of the tribulation. Look at Daniel chapter 3, verse 1. Now, under false pretenses, that peace is broken. He makes the peace with them, and then he sets up this big idol, this big image that he knows, or maybe you don't realize it, but they're prohibited by the Ten Commandments from worshiping this idol. And then he gets them all out to the plain of Dura, and he says, I want you guys we're going to dedicate this, but actually, you're actually going to be worshiping me through all this. Now, the dimensions of the statue, look what it says. It's 60 cubits. Its height is 60 cubits. Width is 6 cubits. That's 60 by 6. So it's a 60-foot tall, 6-foot wide statue. All the Jews, all the Gentiles are gathered underneath the statue, underneath this image of Nebuchadnezzar, just like the beast in the future. Look at verse 4 through 8. And look at what he commands us to do, or commands them to do. Starting in verse 4. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, to you the command is given. All right, so this is the command. This is when everybody's gathered out there on the plains. And I want you to imagine the scene, because there's going to be a really big contrast in just a minute between the majority of the people and just Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and a select few. So the herald comes out and he loudly proclaims, he says, here's what I want you to do. The command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the harp pipe, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. And look at verse 6. That's the command. You guys come and listen. Look at verse 6. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately, that means without a trial, that means without any kind of due process, that means drugged right off the plains and taken for judgment. They'll be cast into the midst of the fiery of a furnace of blazing fire. Therefore, at that time, when all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshipped. Here's the dedication. Now they're worshiping. He changed it on them. In other words, he set a peace with them, And now under false pretenses, he breaks the peace by asking them to violate the commandments of God. But when they heard the band, everybody fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Look at verse 8. For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. The herald speaks up, says, this is what we're going to do. We want all you guys to bow and worship the image. Revelation 13, verse 8, all will be called to worship the Antichrist. Revelation chapter 13, verse 15, those not complying will worship the Antichrist, and worshiping the Antichrist will be killed. So there's your parallel. But look at verse 8. Now, I want you to really notice verse 8. For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans or Babylonians came forward and brought charges against who? The Jews. What's that? Anti-Semitism. That's not new. It's not a phenomenon that came across in the 1940s with Adolf Hitler. This is something that's been around for a while. Brought charges against. The literal translation from Aramaic is ate the pieces of. The same kind of thing goes on in Matthew 24, verse 9, in the Olivet Discourse. Jesus is talking about this same kind of anti-Semitic attitude. So look at verses 9 through 12 now and see how this story goes on. They responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music is to fall down and worship the golden image. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a furnace of a blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely, here we go, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. That's not true. They showed up for the dedication. So this verse is mixed. It's half truth, half lie. All right? He said, they've disregarded you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up. Now, that part is true. They don't do that. But look at the subtlety of it. Actually, it's not so subtle. It's kind of overt, but it's a little tricky on their part. Look what they're doing in verse 10. They remind the king what he'd said. They said, O king, you said this. This is your rule. You said everybody comes out, we're going to strike up the band, and then when they hear the music, they bow down and worship the statue. He said, those are your words. That's what you said. Then verse 12, he said, but these guys, he said, you've appointed them even over administration. They have government jobs. They work directly for you in the palace. And he said, they've disregarded you. Again, that's a lie. They showed up. They were there and disregard him in that sense. They showed up to the plains to where the statue was. But he's right about the last part. They don't worship those gods. They're not going to worship that golden image. And remember, these guys are about the same age as Daniel, so they're probably 14 to 16 years old. These are young teenage kids. And they're being raised up, and God is providentially guiding them so strongly that they have this cushy kind of job in the administration, but they don't forget who God is. And so God calls them out, and they go out into this plain. They see the statue, and they refuse to do it. And look at verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and anger, and that this is when it says in rage and anger, that means he's really, really mad. All right, that's really emphasizing the point. He gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then these men were brought before the king. Verse 14. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, and the bagpipe, and all kinds of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, very well." In other words, I'm going to give you a second chance. Remember what he said. He said out of his own mouth, he said to the herald, this is what I want you to tell people. If you guys hear the music and bow, you're fine. If you don't, immediately, we're going to drag you off of the field, and we're going to throw you in the fiery furnace. Now they come to, because he never thought anybody would disobey his order. Now he gets these 3 Hebrew kids that he likes. They're valuable to his kingdom. They're valuable to his administration. And these Babylonian officials come and say, well, those Hebrews that you put in charge of things, they're not obeying, they're not bowing. So he calls them and he says, is it true? It's almost like he's hoping they're going to say, no, that's not true. We bowed, he just didn't see us. He said, is it true? And then he says, I'm going to give you a second chance. Kings don't give second chances. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't give second chances. But he's going to give it to these kids. He said, if you're willing to do it, if you hear the music, we're going to do this again. We're going to do it again. We're going to strike up the band again. If you hear the music, and you're going to bow very well. But look what he says. But if you don't, you'll be immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? And he's not talking about Jehovah God. He's talking about his gods. He said, I'm going to take you immediately. I'm going to give you the second chance. That's it. I'm going to throw you in the furnace if you don't. And what gods of Babylon are there that are going to deliver you? That's what he's asking them. Look at verse 16 now. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king. And they said, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. All right? We're not going to fall for this. This is not an arrogant remark. You can read verse 16. I think they're being smart alecks or they're being arrogant. They're saying we don't need to answer you on this. They're not being arrogant. That's not what this is. It means that they are. And I'm not trying to say this right. They're not pleading not guilty. That's what they're saying. They're saying we're not trying to tell you we're not guilty. We don't have to answer you. In other words, we're guilty. We did it. That's what they're saying. We didn't bow. And so look at verse 17 now, because verse 17, I think, is one of the most powerful statements of anybody in the Bible, and it's made by some teenagers. Look at verse 17. If it be so, our God whom we serve. They're talking about Jehovah now, not Babylonian God. Nebuchadnezzar said, I'm going to throw you in the fire. What Babylonian God is there to deliver you? They switch it now and they say, if it be so, in other words, if you do throw us in this fire, because we're not going to bow. So if you follow through with your plan and throw us in, the God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. Look at verse 18 now. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we're not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Now again, this is not arrogant. They're not being arrogant. They're just saying we're not pleading not guilty. You know, we're not going to defend this. We didn't do it. Now look at verse 17, because it's interesting grammar in verse 17. He says, if it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver. He's not talking about, that does not mean grammatically that if God is able to do it, because if you are a believer, you know God is able to do it. It doesn't mean if God is able. It means, and watch this, because here's the biggie, it means if God chooses to do it. Because sometimes, and I want to just tell you, sometimes in your life, you walk through a fire. So sometimes you do. And sometimes God allows the fire to happen, but he's with you. We're going to see that in this story. So sometimes you don't escape the persecution. Sometimes you don't escape the disease. Sometimes you don't escape the relationship problem. Sometimes you don't escape the financial crisis. Sometimes you just don't get out of those things, but God is with you through them. That's the key for us. Sometimes you do escape. Sometimes God does allow you to go around the problem, or sometimes God removes the problem. So what they're saying is, and these are teenagers now, and here's what they're saying. We're not pleading not guilty, so you do what you got to do. But let me just tell you, King, if you throw us in this fire, if God chooses to, he'll deliver us. If he chooses to do that. Now look at verse 18, because let's look at verse 18 first. But even if he does not, even if we perish in the fire, is what they're saying. Even if he does not, in verse 18. Let it be known to you, O king, that we're not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Either way, and here's the beautiful part for a Christian, and I really want you to get this. It's especially pertinent by what's going on in the world now with the virus situation. Here's what this means. And sometimes people think pastors being cliche when we say this, or that we're just giving a flippant response, or just not really paying attention. Either way is deliverance. Either way is good for the one that knows God. For the one that has put their faith and trust in Jesus, either way is okay. Either way is deliverance. Because the Bible says to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. So either way. So here's what they're saying. If we perish in the fire, no big deal. We'll be with Jesus. We'll be with God. If we survive the fire, then glory to God for that. And we'll keep serving Him. But either way for us is delivered. Sometimes we have loved ones that are sick. I mean, people are dying all over the world from this virus. I mean, they're minding their own business. They catch a virus and it overpowers their body, and their body just can't keep up with it. For a Christian, I mean, we don't want to. We like to think we don't want to die that way. We don't want to die succumbing to some virus. But what if we do? What if God chooses our exit from this world that way? Either way, we win. Either way, it's deliverance. If God delivers me from a disease and heals me, and I'm back on my feet, I want to keep serving Him. If God takes me home through whatever disease it is, then I'm with Him for all eternity. Isn't that the beautiful part of being a Christian? That either way things go, we win. We're always on the winning side. There's never a time as a Christian where you're going to lose. And that's what this story illustrates for us. Verse 18, look at it again. It's one of the most fantastic verses in the Word of God in teaching me and you how to live within God's will. We're going to live inside or within God's will. God's will is best. And as long as I'm in God's will, I'm always going to win. Now, Nebuchadnezzar gets really mad at this second chance. All right? Hebrews 11:32 through 40 record instances like this. By faith, these kids did that. Not by their intellect, not by their great wisdom, not by their charm. It's by faith. It's by faith that God delivered them. Listen, sometimes our faith gets weak. Maybe a story like this tonight is what you're looking for. Maybe you're bummed out because you're stuck in the house. Maybe you're scared to death to go in Walmart or to go out in public. Maybe your fears are getting the best of you right now. You need to learn that faith is what matters. It's faith in God. It's be smart. It's be careful. It's use common sense, but ultimately have faith. Have faith in who God is. That's what these kids did. Isaiah 41:8. It teaches us this. Christians are... Well, let me just say it like this. For the majority of Christians, it's very difficult for us as Christians to accept God's will if God's will is different than our will. If God agrees with us, then everything's fine. We don't mind getting on board. But if we have a plan, and then God deviates from our plan, we have a hard time getting on board. We have a hard time following that. And here's these 3 Hebrew children. Remember what's happened to them. They're minding their own business in Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar comes through, snatches them away, brings them back to Babylon, teaches them all this Babylonian stuff, raises them in the palace, teaches them to be government officials. But they don't give up on Jehovah. They didn't give up on the God of the Hebrews. And so when push comes to shove and they make this choice, it's like Daniel. And here's what I want to encourage you to do. The Bible says about Daniel that he purposed in his heart beforehand that he wasn't going to defile himself with the king's meat. Beforehand. You don't make these courageous, bold, I'm going to stand with God no matter what decisions by flying by the seat of your pants. You don't do it at the last minute when the confrontation comes. You decide that beforehand. You understand that whatever comes up, I'm standing on God's side. That's what these teenagers did. That's why it's a great example for us. And so there's lessons from these guys. There's lessons for us. Here's the first lesson I just told you. These kids, these teenagers, accepted God's will, even though it was different from theirs. That's what you and I have to realize. We have to realize that we have to accept God's will no matter what. It may be different than ours. It may cost us something. It may not be pleasant. But we have to accept God's will no matter what. And then watch this. Their obedience, and see, this is a biggie too, because we're like, and I really hate to use this phrase, but we're kind of like with God, quid pro quo kind of thing. And excuse me for using that term, because I'm not trying to be political. But we like to be obedient with God if we get something in return. If God, I'll go to church, but I want that new job. I'll tithe if you give me a raise. You give me that TV I want. You know, we like to put contingencies on our obedience. God, I'm going to obey you if it's pleasant to me. If it benefits me, I'll obey. But here's what we say. We may not verbally say this, but it's in our heart. We'll say, God, if it's unpleasant, if you're asking me to do something that's uncomfortable, then count me out. That's the only way I can do that. I want to tell you something. I want you to hear me when I say this. There's a lot of times in your life where God is going to ask you to do something that makes no sense and is highly uncomfortable. That's oftentimes how He works. He asks us to do stuff that's confusing. He asks us to do stuff that seems crazy. But it's faith. Remember Hebrews 11:32-40. By faith, these three kids did what they did. Look at verse 19. Because they turned him down a second time. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath, and his facial expression was altered. I mean, his face, you ever made somebody so mad their face just got bent out of joint? That's what happened here. His facial expression was altered towards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He answered by giving orders, watch this, to heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. In other words, you guys really made me mad. I'm gonna pump this heat up in this furnace 7 times hotter than we've ever had it. Verse 20, he commanded certain valiant warriors who were in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You ever wonder why they're going to tie up 3 teenage kids just to throw them in a furnace to be incinerated? This doesn't make sense to me. It sounds like a waste of rope, but that's what they do. They tie them up, they're going to tie them in the furnace. Verse 21, then these men were tied up in their trousers, their coats, their caps, and their other clothes, and were cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. For this reason, and watch this, because the king's command was urgent, and the furnace had been made extremely hot, the flame of the fire slew those men, or killed those men, who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire, still tied up. So look at what's going on here. He gets so angry, he ordered the furnace heated hotter than it's ever been. Verse 20 and 21, they got valiant men. Valiant is strong. He got strong soldiers, strong warriors. He comes in and they bind them up. Verse 21, it even tells you what they were wearing. That's typical Babylonian clothes. They're wearing caps, turbans, outer clothes. They're really dressed. Verse 22, as they throw them in, because they heated it 7 times hotter, as they open the door to throw them in. Now watch this, because this is a really telling story, a really telling episode, detail of the story that really shows you the power and providence of God. So they open this door, and they're going to shove in those 3, which they do, tied up, it says. And so, exposed to the same flames, exposed to the same heat, exposed to the same punishment, they push them into the fire, but that fire doesn't bother them at this point. But the guys on the outside throwing them in, it kills them. It takes their life. Verse 23, they get thrown into the fire. All right? So they're in. So they're in the fire. Outside the fire is the soldiers who die. Now watch this story. Look at verse 24. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded and stood up in haste. He said to his high officials, "Was it not 3 men we cast bound into the midst of the fire?" They replied to the king, "Certainly, O king." He said, "Well, look, I see 4 men loosed and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the God." That's a description that's telling us that he saw a deity. In other words, we believe, and probably so, this is a theophany of Christ. In other words, Jesus was incarnated in Bethlehem. He took on human flesh. But at times like this, he made a pre-incarnate visit. I don't think this is an angel. I think it's Jesus pre-incarnated that stepped into the fire with those 3 Hebrew children. That's why it astounded Nebuchadnezzar of how he looked. Didn't look like a man. Angels look like men. Every time you see an angel in the Bible where they talk about it, it says they look like a man. This one doesn't. And so watch what happens now, because here's the spiritual principle for us. They threw those 3 into the midst of the fire. Who's in the fire? Jesus is in the fire with them. God is there with them. Outside the fire is the soldiers without Christ. So here's the principle. Those outside of Christ die. Those inside the fire with Christ survive. In other words, for a Christian, we're born twice. Physical birth and spiritual birth. But then we just die once. Then we're in the presence of God. Those outside of Christ are born once and they die twice. A physical death and a spiritual death. The Bible says, blessed are those, us, who don't take part in that second death. Because we only die once. Inside the fire with Christ is better than being on the outside of the fire without Him. So no matter what you're going through today, if you are a child of God, if you belong to Jesus, if you know Him as your Savior, then whatever you're going through, it's better for you to be going through your difficulty right now with Jesus with you than to not be going through the problem and being by yourself and being without Christ. That's what this story teaches us. So look at verse 20. Let's see, where do we leave off? Verse 26. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire. He responded and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, you servants of the Most High God. Changed his tune now, isn't he? And come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire. The satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's high officials gathered around and saw in regard to these men that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men, nor was the hair of their head singed, nor were their trousers damaged, nor had the smell of fire even come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It doesn't stick. He waffles back and forth. He'll say this a couple of times, then he'll go back to his old ways. But at this point, at least he's partway believing. Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel. Really, what is angel? Sent his angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command and yielded up their bodies so as not to serve or worship any God except their own true God. Therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses reduced to a rubbish heap, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. That's the same punishment he said he was going to give the wise men if they couldn't interpret his dream. And then verse 30. Then the king caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper in the province of Babylon. Cast 3 in, sees 4. Nebuchadnezzar sees what's going on, brings them out, and then he responds to them. Now, there's a couple of reasons for suffering. People always, we'll close with this. People always wonder why suffering exists anyway. I mean, why are we going through things? I don't know the mind of God. I'm certainly not going to try to speak for him. But I can tell you biblically, there's reasons for suffering. The first is, what does the world see through it? What does the world see in the suffering? Look at this story. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego go into the fiery furnace. They go in there. But what does the world see? They see Jesus with them. That's what made the difference for Nebuchadnezzar. He said, didn't we throw 3 in? They said, yeah. He said, why do I see 4? And he said, not only do I see 4, he said, the 4th looks like a son of a God, and they're not bound anymore, and they're walking around. It's not harming them. Why are you going through suffering? Because what does God want the world to see in you through your suffering? How are you responding to it? Are you continuing to go to church? Are you continuing to be faithful? Are you continuing to pray? Are you continuing to honor God? Or have you bailed on him through the suffering? What's the world see? And then watch Nebuchadnezzar. Because here's the second reason for suffering. What is the reaction of the world or unbelievers when they see the reaction of the believers in the suffering? Nebuchadnezzar saw them. They said, we don't care. If God delivers us, so be it. We'll be delivered. If he kills us, so be it. We'll be with him. We win either way. Then he throws them in. God is there with them, rescues them. What does he see? What does Nebuchadnezzar see in them? That faith in God means something. That faith in God drives our obedience. Faith in God drives our actions. That's what he sees. That's what the world sees. So when you're going through suffering, maybe it's not that God is punishing you. I mean, that's usually not the case. I mean, God's not vindictive. Maybe that the suffering that you're going through is meant to show the grace of God to somebody that doesn't know him. Maybe that's the point of all this. And so look at the last result of this. What does Nebuchadnezzar do? He says, blessed be the God of these 3. And then he says, woe to anybody that speaks ill of this God or worships another God. There's no God like him. He said, if you do, then I'm going to kill you and reduce your house to a rubbish heap. So in other words, if you go through suffering, if your reaction is faithfulness through the suffering, and then the world sees your reaction through the suffering, and then that's how God gets their attention to break through into their life. Look at the end of this. God is now praised by the world. The world threw them in the fire. The world saw Jesus with them in the fire. And then the world praised God because of the deliverance of Jesus and because of the reaction and the faith of the believers. Verse 27 says, there's no fire anywhere, no trace of it. It's not on their clothes, not on their skins, not in their hair. There's no trace. And then Nebuchadnezzar has a 6-point or 7-point praise. He says, blessed be God. God sent an angel. God delivered his servants. The servants put their trust in him. They violated the king's orders, yet God provided. They yielded their bodies. What's Romans chapter 12, verse 1 and 2 say? To sacrifice your bodies, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, which is your reasonable service. They didn't worship any other gods. Nebuchadnezzar said, those are 7 things I see in these kids. Romans chapter 6, Paul even says to yield our members or our body to the works of righteousness. Give it to Him. And then Nebuchadnezzar's decree prospers those Hebrew children, teenagers. They prosper. So let me end by saying this. There's different trials result in different things. And you can go and read these. For King David, his trials were punitive. 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 10. In other words, it's punishment. For Ezekiel, his trial was an example to others. That's Ezekiel chapter 24. For Job, his trial, you know what Job went through, his trial was proof that believers don't serve God just because of what they can get. In other words, will you serve God for nothing? That's what Job teaches us. Will you serve God even if God didn't give you anything else? Even if God gives you no other blessings, even if God gives you nothing else the rest of your life except your salvation, will you still serve Him? Job went through trials to prove that believers will. For Paul, his trials were preventative. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. For Peter, his trials are for sharing. 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 12 and 13. And in John, for John, his trials are for a testimony. That's Revelation chapter 1, verse 9. But that's what happened in Daniel chapter 3. These three Hebrew children that knew God stood up for God, and as a result went through a trial, and their trial was so that the world could see their faithfulness in God's deliverance. And then the world, at the end of the chapter, worships and praises the God of the Hebrews. Stay faithful. Doesn't matter what you're going through. God's not forgotten you. God's not quit loving you. Did you know there's nothing you can do to make God love you less, and there's nothing you can do to make God love you more? God has an agape love for you, a perfect love that we just can't explain. So no matter what you're going through, stay faithful to God. He'll always be with you. He'll never leave you. He'll never forsake you. Thank you for joining us tonight, and I hope you continue to pray for, if you're watching, if you're a Spring Creek member, keep praying for our church, praying for decisions that we have to make regarding all these shutdowns and closures and the virus situation. If you're a member of another church, thank you so much for watching tonight. We're going to do this every Wednesday night as long as we're on quarantine and lockdown. We'll do it at 6:30 on Wednesday nights, and we'll start next Wednesday. We'll go over Daniel chapter 4. Keep praying for your churches. Keep praying for our government leaders. It's got to be hard on them to try to navigate. If we think it's hard to try to navigate decisions for a church, imagine what the leaders are doing, trying to make decisions for the whole country. So pray for them. They need it. And until we see you next Wednesday night, God bless you. We're going to have a service Sunday morning at 10:15. If you don't have a church that you normally attend or normally watch, watch us online Sunday morning at 10:15, and then be back with us Wednesday night at 6:30. Again, we love you. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you have a good rest of your Wednesday evening. God bless you.